Hello, my dear learners. First of all, I welcome you all to this module on gender and media. When discussing media, it's known to you all that cinema plays a significant role in it. This module will introduce you to different gender dialogues, including feminist, queer, and masculinity studies in cinema, while examining how films construct, challenge, and negotiate gender identities. The module also will address spectatorship, reception, and the role of media in shaping gendered subjectivities. Dear learners, the main objectives of this module are to develop a critical understanding of gender in cinema, also to analyze films through feminist, queer, and masculinity studies frameworks. It also will recognize the intersections of gender with race, caste, class, and sexuality in film, and also will engage with debates on spectatorship, representation, and digital media's role in shaping gender narratives. At the very outset, my dear learners, let us discuss gender as a social construct and its distinction from sex and sexuality. Gender in film studies is best understood as a social construct, distinct from biological sex and sexuality. While sex refers to biological attributes such as male, female, or intersex, and sexuality refers to sexual orientation such as heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual, etc., gender is shaped by cultural, historical, and social norms. And cinema plays a crucial role in constructing and reinforcing these norms, portraying gender identities as fixed rather than being fluid identities. Here, the debate between biological determinism and social constructivism is central to gender studies. Biological determinism argues that gender roles are rooted in biology, suggesting that men and women behave differently due to innate characteristics. In contrast to that, dear my dear learners, social constructivism posits that gender is learned through socialization, media representation, and also cultural practices. Films, like any other forms of mass media, often reflect and also perpetuate these constructs. It also reinforces traditional gender roles or at times challenges them. Moving on to intersectionality, my dear learners, it is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. It is crucial in understanding gender in films. It recognizes that gender doesn't exist in isolation but intersects with race, class, caste, and sexuality. In this process, it shapes individuals' experiences differently. For instance, a white woman and a Dalit woman may both face gender discrimination, but their experiences are shaped by race and caste hierarchies. Cinema both reflects and critiques these intersections, making film analysis a vital tool for understanding gender complexities. Now, coming to the larger dialogue on representation in cinema and gender, my dear learners, let us first understand concept of representation in cinema. Representation in cinema shapes how audiences perceive gender, race, class, and sexuality. Stuart Hall's representation theory argues that media does not passively reflect reality but actively constructs it through language, signs, and codes. Hall introduces three approaches here. The first one is reflective. It says media mirrors reality. Then comes intentional approach. Meaning is shaped by the creator's intent. And the third one is constructionist approach. It says meaning is socially constructed through discourses. In cinema, representation often relies on stereotypes, archetypes, and also on myths. Stereotypes simplify and exaggerate characteristics, reinforcing social hierarchies by generalizing them. For example, the femme fatale, the submissive housewife, and for that matter, even the motherly instinct of women. On the other hand, archetypes derive from Carl Jung's theory and they are universal character models. The image of masculine hero is an example of archetype. Another significant representation concept is myths. According to Rolla Barthes, myths shape cultural narratives. For example, you can pick the cinematic portrayal of the ideal woman or hyper-masculine hero myths here. Feminist critics of media representation challenge such stereotypes, archetypes, and representation of myths. It critiques how women are objectified and marginalized in cinema. We'll discuss about Laura Mulvey's male gaze theory and its critique oppositional gaze by bell hook, and as well as contemporary feminist film criticism later in this module. But before that, let us discuss in brief about male-female binary in film. Cinema has historically reinforced a rigid male-female binary. Cinema depicts men as active subjects and women as passive objects. Traditional gender roles in classical Hollywood cinema positioned men as heroes or protectors, providers, or the decision makers and agents of narrative action, while women were often confined to domestic, romantic, or secondary roles. Films like Casablanca and Rear Window are examples of such representations. In these films, women exist primarily as love interests or sources of male motivation. However, subversion and resistance emerged through early feminist interventions. In the 1940s, film noir introduced the femme fatale with powerful yet often punished female figure. The 1970s feminist film movement, led by scholars like Laura Mulvey, called for counter-cinema that challenged the gender norms. Many female directors tried redefining female subjectivity by shifting narrative focus and visual techniques. Globally, cinema has engaged with gender binaries in diverse ways. If we can remember Bollywood's mother figure trope, which is best exampled by Mother Indian in 1957, it has reinforced sacrificial womanhood, while in East Asian films like The Handmaiden, which is released almost half a century after Mother India in 2016, it has subverted patriarchal control. My dear learners, contemporary cinema in many ways and forms continues to challenge binaries, portraying gender as fluid rather than fixed. But it all started in 1970s, when Laura Mulvey started dialogue of male gaze and gender binary in cinema. Feminist film theory emerged in the 1970s was part of a broader feminist movement. It critiqued the patriarchal structure of society and culture, including cinema. One of the most influential texts in feminist film studies is her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. It introduces the concept of the male gaze. Mulvey's work was grounded in psychoanalysis and feminist critique. With her concept of the male gaze, she argues that classical Hollywood films reinforce a patriarchal structure where women are objectified for male pleasure. Using psychoanalysis, she identified two cinematic pleasures: scopophilia, that means the pleasure in looking, and identification, meaning the audience aligning with male protagonist. Mulvey highlights the active or the passive binary in cinema. She said, men are active agents controlling the gaze and driving the narrative, while women are passive spectacles displayed for visual pleasure. Classic Hollywood films such as Vertigo by Hitchcock and Gilda exemplify this dynamic of presenting women as fetishized objects. While Mulvey's theory remains foundational and fundamental to feminist film analysis, contemporary feminist film studies have expanded its scope, considering the female gaze, queer perspective, and intersectional critiques of cinematic representation. Critic Mary Andoane introduced the masquerade, arguing that female characters exaggerate femininity to navigate patriarchal constraints. For example, my dear learners, you all can pick the film noir's female fatal representations as an example here. She also explored female spectatorship, challenging Mulvey's assumption that women are always passive viewers. Kaja Silverman examined how cinema reinforces dominant ideologies, the dominant fiction, but also allows for subversive readings. She analyzed films that disrupt the male gaze by focusing on female subjectivity. However, the most significant critique to Mulvey's theory comes from bell hook. American film critic bell hook's concept of oppositional gaze challenges traditional film theories, particularly Laura Mulvey's male gaze, by highlighting the experience of black women as viewers. In her essay, The Oppositional Gaze, Black Female Spectators, written in 1992, Hooks argues that black women have historically been excluded not only from mainstream cinema, but also by feminist film theories and theorists. It forced them to develop a critical way of looking, which she referred as an oppositional gaze. It raises dominant narrative. Referring to the exclusion of black women from feminist film theory, Hooks critiques Hollywood's history of either stereotyping or erasing black women. She asserts that while white women's objectification is limited within the male gaze, black women face a double exclusion, both from representation in mainstream cinema and from early feminist film critics that largely focused on white female spectatorship only. Feminist film theorists like Mulvey did not initially consider race in the analysis. It led Hooks to call for an intersectional approach that acknowledges how race, gender, and class also shape cinematic experiences. Films like The Color Purple, made in 1985, and Daughters of the Dust in 1991 have challenged racist as well as sexist tropes, offering complex portrayals of black women, breaking away from Hollywood's history of invisibility and stereotype-driven narratives. While discussing feminist film theories beyond Mulvey, we should also have basic understandings of post-feminist film critique. My dear learners, post-feminism in film criticism refers to the cultural shift where feminist ideals are seemingly integrated into mainstream media, often repackaged as individual empowerment rather than collective struggles. Angela McRobbie's concept of post-feminist sensibility critiques how contemporary media celebrates women's independence while subtly reinforcing traditional gender norms. She argues that post-feminism co-opts feminist rhetoric, emphasizing consumerism, choice, and self-surveillance rather than structural change. Post-feminist films often portray hypersexualized female protagonists as symbols of empowerment, blurring the line between agency and objectification. For instance, characters in Sex and the City and Charlie's Angels appear liberated yet exist within a male-dominated visual framework, reinforcing conventional beauty standards and desirability politics. Critics question whether these portrayals genuinely subvert the male gaze or simply repackage it under the guise of a choice. Contemporary feminist criticism highlights how female directors challenge cinematic norms through narrative structure, gaze, and character agency. Filmmakers like Chloe Zhao with Nomadland in 2020 and with Lady Bird in 2017, Greta Gerwig use alternative storytelling methods offering nuanced female subjectivities that resist objectification, expanding feminist discourses in cinema. In India, The Great Indian Kitchen and its multilingual remakes is an example of such storytelling, especially the one in Hindi where the director has her female's perspective. My dear learners, let us now discuss about the portrayal of masculinity in cinema. Cinema has played a crucial role in shaping and reinforcing ideas of masculinity. Therefore, it is very important to understand the dynamic of such representation to understand the larger dialogue of gender in cinema. R.W. Connell's theory of hegemonic masculinity defines it as the dominant form of masculinity that maintains patriarchal power by subordinating both women and non-dominant masculinities. This idealized masculinity is associated with physical strength, emotional restraint, authority, and heterosexual dominance. In early Hollywood, hegemonic masculinity was embodied by stoic, self-reliant men such as John Wayne in westerns. By the 1980s, hyper-masculine action heroes in the Terminator or Rambo reinforced the idea of men as aggressive, dominant figures. In India, 1970s angry young man image is an example of hyper-masculinity. However, the concept has evolved with contemporary cinema questioning these rigid gender norms. We can find films exploring vulnerable, non-dominant masculinities, challenging traditional ideals. The sensitive anti-hero in films like Taxi Driver or Joker reveals the crisis of masculinity, while queer narratives like Moonlight present intimate, emotionally complex male protagonists. Here, we can also analyze few other case studies with few other Western action hero and anti-hero films. In westerns, for example, John Wayne in The Searchers embodied rugged patriarchal masculinity. On the other hand, as an action hero in Die Hard, John McClane was presented as both tough and emotionally vulnerable character. Again, as the anti-hero in the Fight Club, it critiques toxic masculinity and the male identity crisis. Action cinema has long been a site for constructing hypermasculinity. It is a form of exaggerated masculinity that emphasizes physical strength, emotional detachment, and dominance through violence. The 1980s action heroes of Hollywood defined this ideal. Films like Rambo, Predator, and Bloodsport glorified muscular, invincible men solving conflicts through brute force and thus reinforcing hegemonic masculinity. While entertaining audience, these films also promoted toxic masculinity by normalizing aggression and suppression of emotion. It also reinforced the idea that real men must always be dominant. This trope extends to modern franchises like Fast and Furious, where male identity remains tied to power and control. Dear learners, you can by now understand how such portrayal contribute to cultural attitudes that equate masculinity with aggression and emotional repression. However, many recent films challenge hypermasculinity by depicting vulnerable, flawed male protagonists. For example, Logan in 2017 and Drive in 2011 explore the consequences of violence, while Moonlight in 2016 and the TV series The Last of Us present emotionally complex male characters. Such shift in portrayal reflect a growing awareness that masculinity can be diverse, emotional, and non-violent. It leads to the discussions on alternative masculinities and its portrayal, as well as the larger dialogue on queer representation as well. Cinema, as you all can by now observe, has increasingly challenged rigid notions of masculinity by offering portrayals that emphasize emotional depth, gentleness, and also queerness. The emergence of soft masculine and emotionally vulnerable heroes embodied by actors like Shah Rukh Khan and Timothée Chalamet challenges traditional masculinity. Khan's romantic roles in Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, Dil Se, Kuch Kuch Hota Hai and Kal Ho Na Ho, etc. redefines male heroism through vulnerability and emotional expressiveness against the angry young man portrayal of 1970s Bollywood. Similarly, in Western world, Timothy's performance in Call Me By Your Name and The Little Woman, etc. embrace sensitivity and introspections over aggression. Dear learners, while watching films as a conscious film audience, many of you might have observed many contemporary body films to contain implicit homoerotic subjects, where male friendships are emotionally intense but remain within heteronormative frameworks. For example, 1986 film Top Gun or the Lord of the Rings series showcases deep male bond that represent a blurry line between platonic and romantic desire. While often unspoken or being allowed, these dynamics challenges hegemonic masculinity by showcasing, if not centering, on the intimacy between men. On the other hand of such subtle portrayal, art house and indie films have been more explicit in exploring gender fluidity and queer masculinity. We can have few cases to study here. It will be very interesting for you all to observe how films like Orlando, Tangerine, and Titan disrupt binary gender norms, offering complex narratives where masculinity is not defined by dominance but by transformation, vulnerability, and fluidity. In the discussions on gender and cinema, LGBTQIA+ and queer theories made a significant entry in the recent years. Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity is very significant with this regard. Films often portray gender as something that can be performed or subverted. Classic films like Some Like It Hot and Tootsie explores gender fluidity, while contemporary films like The Danish Girl and Paris is Burning highlighted real-life experiences of gender nonconformity. Many films also celebrate or reflect drag and camp aesthetics. These embrace exaggeration, parody, and theatricality, challenging rigid gender norms. John Waters' films like The Pink Flamingo made in 1972 and The Adventures of Priscilla, Queens of the Desert, etc. celebrate such parodically aesthetic elements. RuPaul's Drag Race has popularized drag culture, bringing queer aesthetics into mainstream media while speaking debates on commercialization, authenticity, and gender fluidity in performance. Queer theory offers a unique lens for analyzing mainstream cinema, revealing hidden subtext and queering dominant narratives. Homosocial desire with non-sexual bonds between men, often laden with sexual tension, is central to many classic films, which can be interpreted as homoerotic subtext. For example, directors like Alfred Hitchcock, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, and Wong Kar-wai often have queerness in their films, whether through intimate same-sex relationships or unresolved sexual tensions. The relationship between the protagonist and his female companion in Hitchcock's Rear Window may be read through a queer lens. The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant explores complex female relationships and emotional dependencies. Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love reflect the intense emotional connections between characters that, though not explicitly sexual, are rich with queerness in their ambiguity. Queer audiences often engage with mainstream films by reading hidden subtext in characters' interactions and narratives, creating an alternative, often radical interpretation of the film. This queering of cinema, my dear learners, allows for subversions of traditional gender roles and heteronormative narratives, offering new ways to experience and understand mainstream films. B. Ruby Reed's concept of new queer cinema, coined in the early 1990s, is significant for queer analysis in cinema. It refers to a wave of independent films that offered authentic, unapologetic representations of LGBTQIA+ experiences outside the constraints of mainstream Bollywood. These films often reject assimilation narratives that portray queer characters conforming to heteronormative ideals by embracing radical depictions of queer identities. They question dominant cultural norms as well. Opposing the gay assimilation narrative of Hollywood that tends to focus on mainstream acceptance, this film often highlights queer resistance and cultural difference. Challenging Hollywood's tendency to normalize LGBTQIA+ characters by eventual integrations of them into heteronormative society, new queer cinema explores the complexities of queer life without prioritizing assimilations into mainstream values. You all can observe such representations in films like Paris is Burning, Moonlight, and Portrait of Lady on Fire, etc. In India, cinema, like any other art form, has long been shaped by complex dynamics of gender, caste, and class, where marginalized communities, particularly Dalit women, face multiple layers of oppression. Intersectionality is crucial to understand how Dalit women are represented in Indian cinema. These portrayals often reflect social hierarchies and reinforce caste-based discrimination, while sometimes offering subversive narratives that challenges these systems. Regional Indian films or the films made in language other than Hindi often offer more subversive narratives that engage with caste, gender, and sexuality in complex ways. A feminist or queer reading of such films can reveal their potential to question dominant cultural norms. Here, you can try to observe such potential in films like Fenri or The Sairat or the Article 15. Women filmmakers have historically been marginalized in mainstream cinema. However, over the time they have developed distinctive voices that challenges dominant cinematic conventions. Authorism and gender interest when discussing women directors, as their works more often reflect unique perspective on gender, identity, and social norms as well. By engaging with personal and feminist themes, women filmmakers in world cinema create narratives that challenge patriarchal structures in both content and form. Since 1970s, feminist collectives and alternative film movements provided a platform for women to create films that defied traditional male-centric storytelling. This collective prioritized collaborative, non-hierarchical production process, producing films that critically examined women's role in society and showcased underrepresented perspectives. My dear learners, to better understand this, you can watch and analyze the films of French filmmaker Agnès Varda, Indian filmmaker Mira Nair and Deepa Mehta, Belgian director Chantal Akerman, American director Barbara Hammer and Jens Ford, etc. Indigenous and non-Western filmmaking plays a critical role in the representation of gender. They offer an alternative narratives, often challenging Western ideas of masculinity and femininity. Indigenous filmmakers frequently use gendered storytelling to reflect their community values and to reclaim cultural identities. While doing so, they try to give voice to marginalized women by presenting alternative gender roles that do not conform to colonialist or Western mainstream representations. That is why, my dear learners, we can observe women directors from Africa, Latin America, and Asia to bring unique perspectives to gender in their cinema. While addressing issues such as gender-based violence, identity, and empowerment, this set of filmmakers also engage with the complexities of colonialism, cultural traditions, and social hierarchies. For example, African filmmaker in Timbuktu examined the role of women in post-colonial societies, while Latin American directors in films like The Milk of Sorrow and depicts the intersections of gender, trauma, and indigenous traditions. In India, Deepa Mehta have explored the impact of patriarchy on women through films like Art, Fire, and Water. Cyril Dunez, The Watermelon Woman, make an interesting point of entry here. This groundbreaking work in African American queer cinema explores the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality, focusing on the journey of a black lesbian filmmaker as it uncovers the forgotten history of black women in cinema. This film critiques historical erasure and highlights the complexity of intersectional identities. Now coming to politics of spectatorship, it explores how audience engage with films and media. It's shaped by their identity, culture, and socio-political context. It examines how power dynamics such as race, gender, and class influence who gets to watch what, how they interpret that, and how they are represented in cinema. As we all have discussed earlier, traditional cinematic theories, particularly Laura Mulvey's male gaze, suggest that films to get often constructed with male perspective, positioning women as objects of desire. However, female spectatorship challenges this framework by saying women may identify with female characters by rejecting objectification and disrupting the male-dominated gaze. Fan cultures with feminist fandoms makes a significant point of entry in such discussions. It offers a platform for women spectators to engage with media through creative expressions, criticisms, and reinterpretations of popular films. It often creates an alternative readings of films that emphasize women's agency and empowerment. Many online platforms have become spaces for women and marginalized groups to challenge mainstream narratives by offering counter readings of films and TV shows. It helps in reclaiming the representations of female characters, particularly in genres like sci-fi actions and superhero films, where they critique gender inequality and highlight underrepresented voices. These communities challenge the traditional passive reception by contributing to active feminist modes of viewing. The rise of social media and streaming platforms has created new avenues for gender inclusivity in media representations as well as for cinematic representation. Independent filmmakers and creators can directly reach diverse audiences, contributing to more nuanced portrayals of gender with these new media platforms. With an audience highly active in participation, these platforms have the potential to greater diversity in storytelling. Therefore, web series like Transparent and A Pause have embrace diverse gender identities and challenge traditional representations. However, despite such potential and the progress to some extent, algorithm bias in film recommendation systems can perpetuate gender stereotypes. Data-driven algorithms recommended content based on viewers' past references. It can lead to the reinforcement of gendered patterns in film consumptions. For example, gendered content filters might suggest romantic comedies to women and action films to men. It will further reinforce traditional gender roles once again. We can say the politics of spectatorship with regard to digital platforms will take some time to understand and take a shape. With this, my dear learners, we come to the end of this module. In this module, we have learned about the evolving landscape of cinema to challenge traditional gender representations, from feminist film theories to independent digital filmmaking, diverse voices and reshaping of narratives. We also have discussed about the politics of spectatorships. As spectatorships becomes more active and inclusive, Ongoing critical engagement ensures that gender representation in film remains dynamic, intersectional, and transformative. I hope this module will help you to acquire some basic understanding on different debates and discussions on the theories and concepts of gender and cinema. Next week, with the next module, we will discuss something more about gender and media. So see you again in the next module. Till then, keep watching cinema, keeping in mind intersectional identities and its representations. Bye-bye.